I have completed the production process of my podcast, and now I have a final product. The first thing that I did in this process was record my scripted elements with the microphone and the sound desk. I believe that this part went well. This is because of my prior experience and knowledge of how to use this equipment. This includes what volume the microphone should be at so it doesn't peak. There was an aspect of my production process that didn't go well. This is the fact that I didn't plan enough scripted elements to fill the required amount of time. This would mean that I would not have met the brief. I did eventually fix this by writing more scripted elements and recording them. This allowed my podcast to reach the 10-minute mark. I adhered to most of my plans during this stage. I recorded every scripted element that I had originally planned. This meant that the order of the content throughout the podcast made more sense and made a more enjoyable listening experience for the listeners. I believe the research that I did helped me quite a bit throughout this stage of creating my podcast. The most helpful one was my research on how to make a good podcast. This gave me information and tips on presenting. The planning stage of my podcast also really helped at this point. Since I have planned everything, I was able to record the scripted parts of my podcast easily. From recording the scripted elements of my podcast, I have learned a lot more about presenting information and also hosting a podcast. This might come in useful during my final major project. I have learned a lot more about the process of making a podcast throughout this part of the production stage. I have learned how to present a podcast and how the information should be structured throughout an episode. I have learned many new skills about the production process, one of these being presenting. This is the main skill that I have developed by reading the scripted elements throughout the podcast. I have gained more of a feeling for presenting, which is going to be useful for future projects like my final major project. One of those is merely clearly speaking. I had to re-record some parts of my scripted elements since they were not understandable. This took more time, which pushed back the amount of time that I had for the editing process. The next section of my podcast production process was recording the interview itself. The first thing that I had to do was organise the time with my interviewees so I can meet them and conduct the interview. This part of the interview process had its ups and downs. This resulted in the date of recording having to be moved, which was negative since it delayed the editing process. But this part of my production process was altogether positive, because the interview was still able to be carried out professionally and smoothly. This made the final version of the podcast smoother and also made the editing process easier. As well as that, for convenience for both myself and the interviewee, I arrived before we were due to meet so I could make sure all the equipment was working properly and that the script was available. When it came to recording the interview, I had the scripted questions with me. I extended the two monitors in the recording studio so the interviewee would be able to see the questions as well as me. I followed the script closely and carefully throughout this recording stage. This made the interview easy to record and also made sure that when I started to edit my podcast that everything made sense and I could also cut out the questions just to have my interviewee speak. As mentioned previously, my research on how to make a good podcast helped me when it came to this stage. I used the advice that it gave me to present a professional sounding podcast. This arguably is the most important stage of the podcast creation process. I have learned a lot about conducting an interview while on this stage of the production process. This is mainly interview techniques that are useful for future jobs or any future projects. Example, final major project. I still feel like my interview skills need to develop more, but I think that will come as time goes by. The next stage of the podcast production process was the editing process. This was the part where everything started to come together. I believed that my past knowledge of Premiere Pro made the editing process easier. I also believed that editing my podcast went well for the majority of it, but I did hit a stump while editing my podcast. I hadn't reached the minimum 10 minutes that was outlined in the brief. I had to return back to the recording process, so I had to script more facts. This delayed the final product even more. From this, I learned that even if I script information, it will most likely be shorter than planned. After recording the extra scripted elements of my podcast, I went back to the editing process. I used the information that I have learned about editing to make my podcast have a smooth feel throughout. Fortunately, since I had to record extra scripted elements for my podcast, my running order became outdated. This meant that I wasn't able to adhere to my editing plans. Throughout this part of the unit, I have developed more skills in editing. This includes voice effects that I use throughout the podcast to add a more light-hearted tone. Yet again, I'd like to continue developing my editing skills, since I believe there's a lot more that I need to learn. Throughout the editing stage, I had to edit sound effects and music. I feel like in the end I have met this brief. The brief for this podcast lays out that I needed to make a new 10-minute podcast for a specific target audience. I needed to work by myself to plan and curate a range of material, which I would then edit to create the final product. I believe that I have met this brief successfully in the end. Moving past the problem I had with it being under 10 minutes, I believe that in the end I successfully made sure that my podcast met this brief. This is because my podcast reached that 10-minute mark and includes a range of material, which then I edited to create a final podcast. Altogether, I do believe that my podcast follows the codes and conventions. This is because it offered something new to the audience. I had scripted elements at the beginning, middle and end. There was conversations / interviews with my guests. There was a good quality audio, and also fillers like were not included. I believe that my podcast has grabbed the audience's attention and does create excitement and engages the audience throughout. My podcast includes music and facts, and also is relevant to the genre. At the end, my podcast has a trailer for the next episode, which does again follow the codes and conventions. My podcast is mostly scripted and has a conversational style which is used in the interview. I believe that I could develop these codes and conventions even more by having more than one guest on the podcast. So if I was going to do this in the future, I'd get a few more to discuss what was said in the interview. I also have used multiple sound effects throughout, the most common one being the rewind sound effect. This is because the podcast is called Rewind to the Past, so it feels obvious that I needed to add that to transition between different parts of the podcast. As well as that, since the topic of the first episode was Martin Luther King, I have the soundbite from his I Have a Dream speech. I think that I have successfully appealed to my target audience since I wanted a young audience that wants to learn more about history. So that's why my podcast was modern and upbeat, because it would connect with the younger audience and also teach them a bit. Altogether, I'm happy with the final outcome of my podcast. I do believe if I could do this again, I would change a lot of the ways it was scripted and what the information, and also add more questions to the interview. But altogether, I think my podcast was a success.